The rain hammered against the windows of the safe house in West Berlin as Major James Whitmore pressed his ear to the wall, listening for footsteps in the corridor beyond. It was February 23rd, 1951, and the man who had once defied direct orders on the beaches of Normandy was about to do it again. This time, however, the enemy wore business suits instead of Wehrmacht gray, and the battlefield was a web of lies stretching from London to Moscow. His commanding officer had explicitly forbidden any contact with the Soviet defector waiting 3 floors below, but Whitmore knew that following those orders would mean losing the most valuable intelligence asset to cross into the West since the war's end. The Luger pistol felt cold against his ribs as he checked his watch one final time. In exactly 17 minutes, he would either save dozens of Western agents from execution or become the KGB's next victim himself. No one in British intelligence knew that one man's act of calculated insubordination that night would unravel the Soviet Union's most successful spy ring in Western Europe and establish the blueprint for Cold War counterintelligence operations that would endure for decades. James Edward Whitmore had grown up in the coal-stained streets of Newcastle, where his father worked the mines and his mother took in washing to make ends meet. Born in 1922, he learned early that survival often meant thinking faster than the rules allowed. When the local grammar school teacher noticed his gift for languages and puzzle solving, young James discovered he could decode the complex betting systems the miners used, earning pocket money by helping them calculate odds. His parents sacrificed to keep him in school, and by 1939 he had mastered French, German, and enough Russian to impress his university professors. The invasion of Poland changed everything. On September 4, 1939, the day after Britain declared war, 18-year-old Whitmore walked into the local recruiting station with a head full of irregular verbs and a heart burning with purpose. The recruiting sergeant took one look at his language scores and academic record, then made a phone call that would change the course of Whitmore's life forever. Within 6 weeks, he found himself at a nondescript country estate outside London, learning skills that had no names in any official manual. His instructors taught him to think like the enemy, to see patterns where others saw chaos, and, most importantly, to trust his instincts even when they contradicted everything he had been taught about military discipline. The other trainees nicknamed him the Professor because of his habit of analyzing every training scenario from multiple angles, but they respected him because he never let analysis paralyze action. When the time came to choose volunteers for a special assignment involving intelligence gathering behind enemy lines, Whitmore's name appeared at the top of every instructor's list. He had no idea that the unconventional thinking they were nurturing in him would one day become the Soviet Union's greatest nightmare. By 1944, the Allied forces had spent months preparing for Operation Overlord, the massive amphibious assault on Nazi-occupied France that would open the long-awaited Second Front in Western Europe. The success of D-Day depended not only on overwhelming firepower and careful coordination, but also on accurate intelligence about German defensive positions, troop movements, and communication networks. Hitler's Atlantic Wall stretched along the entire French coastline, a formidable system of concrete bunkers, artillery positions, and obstacles designed to repel any invasion attempt. German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent months strengthening these defenses, particularly around the Pas de Calais, where Nazi intelligence expected the main Allied assault to occur. However, the actual target was the beaches of Normandy, a choice that relied heavily on maintaining absolute secrecy and feeding false information to German reconnaissance networks. British intelligence had developed an elaborate deception operation called Fortitude, designed to convince the Germans that any Normandy landing would be merely a diversionary attack, while the real invasion would come at Calais. The success of this deception required not only careful coordination of double agents and false radio traffic, but also real-time intelligence gathering from operatives already positioned behind enemy lines. These agents, many of them recruited from the Special Operations Executive, operated under constant danger of exposure and death. Their reports on German troop movements, supply lines, and defensive preparations would determine whether the Allied forces met light resistance or walked into a slaughter on the beaches. The stakes could not have been higher, and every piece of intelligence could mean the difference between victory and catastrophe for the entire war effort. As June approached, the pressure on these intelligence networks intensified, and commanders on both sides knew that the next few weeks would determine the fate of Europe for generations to come. The pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, found Lieutenant Whitmore crouched behind a hedgerow 3 miles inland from Omaha Beach, his radio operator's body growing cold beside him. The German patrol that had discovered their position 20 minutes earlier lay scattered among the Norman brambles, but their final transmission had doomed any hope of maintaining operational security. Whitmore's mission had been straightforward in briefing, but impossible in execution. Establish a forward observation post to coordinate artillery support for the beach assault while simultaneously gathering intelligence on German reinforcement schedules. The radio equipment, carefully calibrated to transmit on frequencies that would not interfere with the main assault communications, now lay smashed among the hedgerow roots where a German grenade had found its mark. His orders explicitly forbade him from approaching the main landing zones under any circumstances, as his intelligence value made him too important to risk in direct combat. But as the sounds of battle intensified from the direction of the beach, Whitmore realized that hundreds of Allied soldiers were walking into a trap that only he could warn them about. Through his binoculars, he had observed 2 full companies of SS Panzer Grenadiers moving into concealed positions along the bluffs overlooking Omaha Beach, supported by mobile artillery that Allied intelligence had failed to detect. The German commander had apparently decided to allow the first wave of Allied forces to establish a beachhead before launching a coordinated counterattack designed to drive them back into the sea. Without functioning radio equipment, Whitmore had no way to warn Allied commanders about the impending ambush except to abandon his position and risk everything on a desperate sprint toward the beach. His training officer's voice echoed in his memory, emphasizing that intelligence operatives must never compromise their missions for the sake of immediate tactical considerations, no matter how dire the circumstances might appear. But as machine gun fire began to echo across the Norman countryside, Whitmore made a choice that would define not only his own survival, but also the success of the entire D-Day operation. He gathered the scattered pieces of his radio equipment, improvised a crude transmitter using components salvaged from a destroyed German communications post, and began broadcasting on a frequency he hoped Allied naval gunners would monitor. The improvised radio burst lasted exactly 37 seconds before German direction-finding equipment located Whitmore's position. But those 37 seconds contained enough precise coordinates and tactical information to redirect Allied naval artillery onto the concealed German positions. The USS Nevada, firing from her position offshore, adjusted her targeting based on Whitmore's coordinates and delivered a devastating barrage that destroyed both German artillery positions and scattered the waiting infantry companies. Allied casualties on Omaha Beach, while still severe, were significantly lower than German commanders had anticipated, largely because their carefully planned ambush had been disrupted by intelligence they never suspected existed. Whitmore spent the next 48 hours evading German search parties while making his way back to Allied lines, carrying documents he had retrieved from the destroyed communications post that would prove invaluable for understanding German defensive strategies throughout Normandy. His unauthorized radio transmission, which directly violated his operational orders, had saved an estimated 400 Allied lives and prevented what could have been a catastrophic setback for the entire invasion. The official commendation that followed made no mention of his disobedience, focusing instead on his resourcefulness and dedication to the mission. But his commanding officers had noticed something more important than rule following. Whitmore possessed an intuitive understanding of when conventional wisdom needed to be abandoned in favor of calculated risk-taking. This quality, they realized, would make him exceptionally valuable in the new kind of warfare that was already emerging as the hot war against Nazi Germany began to evolve into a Cold War against the Soviet Union. As Allied forces consolidated their hold on the Norman beachhead and began their advance toward Paris, intelligence analysts were already turning their attention eastward, toward an ally whose intentions were becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish from those of a potential enemy. They would need operators like Whitmore, men who could think beyond the rules when the rules no longer applied to the threats they faced. The end of the war in Europe brought not peace, but a new and more complex form of conflict, one fought with secrets instead of shells, and one through deception rather than destruction. By 1946, the wartime alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union had collapsed into mutual suspicion and competing spheres of influence. Joseph Stalin's regime, having absorbed the Baltic states and imposed communist governments throughout Eastern Europe, began an aggressive intelligence campaign designed to penetrate Western military, political, and scientific institutions. The Soviet NKVD, soon to be reorganized as the KGB, deployed hundreds of agents throughout Britain, France, and the United States, many of them ideologically motivated communists who had been recruited during the war years when the Soviet Union was still considered a trusted ally. These agents, known in intelligence circles as illegals, operated without diplomatic cover and often maintained deep cover identities for years or even decades before being activated for specific operations. Their targets included atomic research facilities, military planning departments, and the highest levels of Western governments, where they sought to acquire both immediate tactical intelligence and long-term strategic insights that would give the Soviet Union decisive advantages in any future conflict. The Cambridge Five, a network of British intelligence officers recruited by Soviet handlers during their university years, represented the most successful of these penetration operations, providing Moscow with access to some of Britain's most closely guarded secrets. Western intelligence services, still organized primarily for wartime operations against conventional military targets, found themselves poorly equipped to counter this new form of warfare. Traditional counterintelligence methods, designed to catch enemy spies operating under military discipline, proved inadequate against ideologically motivated agents who might remain dormant for years before receiving activation orders. The challenge was not simply to catch Soviet spies, but to understand their methods, predict their targets, and develop new techniques for identifying and neutralizing threats that operated according to completely different rules than any enemy Western intelligence had previously faced. This was the environment in which James Whitmore found himself when he returned from France in 1945, decorated for heroism, but already being recruited for a new and more dangerous mission. British intelligence assigned Whitmore to a classified unit known officially as the Joint Intelligence Committee Liaison Section, but referred to by its members simply as the Circus. Based in a series of connected buildings near St. James's Park, the unit's mission was to develop new methods for detecting and countering Soviet intelligence operations within Britain and Western Europe. The work required a unique combination of analytical skill, operational experience, and psychological insight, as agents needed to understand not only Soviet methods, but also the motivations of individuals who would betray their own countries for ideological reasons. Whitmore's wartime experience in reading enemy communications and his intuitive grasp of unconventional tactics made him an ideal candidate for this new form of warfare. But it was his willingness to question established procedures that truly distinguished him from his colleagues. While other analysts focused on identifying known Soviet agents and tracking their activities, Whitmore became convinced that the real threat came from agents who had never been identified by Western intelligence services. His theory, considered radical by many of his superiors, in which he participated, creating a dynamic where his greatest successes often occurred precisely when he chose to operate beyond the boundaries of official authority. His superiors found themselves in the paradoxical position of relying on his unconventional approach while simultaneously trying to constrain his independence, recognizing that his effectiveness depended partly on his willingness to take risks that they could not officially authorize. By 1963, Whitmore had been promoted to the position of Deputy Director of Operations for European Counterintelligence, a role that gave him broad authority over British intelligence activities targeting Soviet operations throughout the continent. His success in identifying and neutralizing Soviet agents had earned him respect from Allied intelligence services, but it had also made him a priority target for KGB assassination teams who recognized that his methods posed a unique threat to their operational security. The personal danger he faced was compounded by his public profile within intelligence circles, as his reputation for innovative counterintelligence work made him easily identifiable to Soviet operatives seeking to eliminate Western officials who posed the greatest threat to their activities. Soviet intelligence files captured after the end of the Cold War would later reveal that the KGB had assigned more resources to eliminating Whitmore than to any other single Western intelligence officer, recognizing that his analytical methods and operational techniques represented a fundamental challenge to their traditional approaches to espionage work. Despite repeated attempts on his life and constant surveillance by Soviet agents, Whitmore continued to develop new techniques for detecting and countering KGB operations, including innovations in electronic surveillance, communication security, and agent recruitment that would influence intelligence work for decades after his retirement. His personal philosophy, developed through years of operating in the gray areas between official authorization and operational necessity, emphasized the importance of understanding enemy psychology and adapting tactics to exploit weaknesses in enemy operational doctrine. This approach, while highly effective, required a level of independence and risk-taking that many of his colleagues found uncomfortable, leading to ongoing debates within British intelligence about the proper balance between innovation and institutional control. The resolution of these debates would ultimately depend on whether Whitmore's methods could be systematized and taught to other officers, or whether his effectiveness was too closely tied to his personal qualities to be replicated within a larger organizational framework. The final test of Whitmore's career came in 1967 when British intelligence discovered evidence that a Soviet mole had penetrated the highest levels of NATO command structure and was providing Moscow with detailed information about Western nuclear strategy and defensive planning. The investigation, complicated by political sensitivities and the need to avoid alerting the suspected agent, required exactly the kind of unconventional approach that had defined Whitmore's most successful operations. However, the stakes were higher than any he had previously faced, as failure to identify and neutralize the mole could compromise Western security for decades, while a premature or incorrect accusation could destroy NATO's command structure and end careers of innocent officials. The pressure to proceed cautiously through established channels conflicted directly with the urgent need for decisive action, creating exactly the kind of operational dilemma that Whitmore had confronted throughout his career. His solution characteristically involved abandoning official procedures in favor of a carefully calculated gamble that relied on psychological insights rather than traditional investigative methods. Working with a small team of trusted associates, he developed a sophisticated entrapment operation designed to force the suspected mole into revealing himself through actions that would be invisible to conventional surveillance but apparent to anyone who understood Soviet operational doctrine. The operation required precise timing and absolute secrecy, qualities that could only be achieved by working outside normal intelligence channels and accepting full personal responsibility for the consequences. When the mole was finally identified and arrested, his confession revealed that he had been providing Soviet intelligence with NATO's most sensitive strategic information for more than 5 years, a betrayal that had given Moscow unprecedented insight into Western military planning and defensive capabilities. The successful resolution of the case established Whitmore's reputation as the preeminent counterintelligence officer of his generation, but it also marked the end of his active operational career, as senior officials decided that his methods, while effective, created too many political and bureaucratic complications for continued use within the increasingly complex alliance structures of the Cold War era. Whitmore retired from active intelligence work in 1971, but his influence on Western counterintelligence methods continued long after his departure from operational duties. The techniques he had developed for identifying Soviet penetration agents became standard procedures within British intelligence and were adopted by Allied services throughout NATO. His emphasis on psychological profiling and pattern analysis established new disciplines within intelligence work that combined traditional surveillance methods with insights drawn from behavioral psychology and statistical analysis. More importantly, his career demonstrated that effectiveness in counterintelligence work often required the flexibility to operate beyond established procedures, a lesson that influenced the training and operational philosophy of an entire generation of intelligence officers. The CIA, recognizing the value of his innovations, invited him to spend 2 years as a special consultant helping to develop new training programs for American counterintelligence specialists. His influence extended beyond specific techniques to broader questions about the relationship between individual initiative and institutional authority within intelligence organizations, debates that continued to shape policy discussions throughout the Cold War and beyond. Students of intelligence history would later recognize that Whitmore's career represented a crucial transition period in the evolution of counterintelligence work, demonstrating how techniques developed during World War II could be adapted and refined to meet the different challenges posed by Cold War espionage. His willingness to question established procedures and develop new approaches to familiar problems established precedents that influenced intelligence work long after the Soviet Union had ceased to exist, proving that innovation in intelligence, like innovation in any field, often requires the courage to challenge conventional wisdom and accept responsibility for unconventional results. The irony of Whitmore's career was that a man who had built his reputation on breaking rules ultimately became the foundation for new rules that would guide counterintelligence work for decades. The analytical methods he had developed through intuition and improvisation were systematized into training curricula and operational protocols that were taught to intelligence officers throughout the Western Alliance. His insight that effective counterintelligence required understanding enemy psychology as much as enemy techniques became a cornerstone of intelligence education, influencing how analysts approached everything from agent recruitment to operational planning. The personal qualities that had made him effective, his willingness to take calculated risks, and his ability to recognize when conventional approaches were inadequate, proved more difficult to institutionalize than his specific techniques. Intelligence organizations struggled to balance the need for individual initiative with requirements for accountability and coordination, a tension that reflected broader questions about how institutions adapt to changing operational environments. Whitmore himself, in retirement, became a thoughtful analyst of these issues, writing extensively about the challenges of maintaining innovation within bureaucratic structures and the importance of preserving space for unconventional thinking within organizational frameworks designed to promote predictability and control. His reflections on intelligence work emphasized that the most effective operations often occurred at the intersection of careful planning and improvised adaptation, requiring officers who could master established procedures while remaining prepared to abandon them when circumstances demanded different approaches. This philosophy, developed through decades of operational experience, provided valuable insights not only for intelligence professionals, but for anyone responsible for making critical decisions under pressure and uncertainty. When historians finally gained access to Soviet intelligence archives after the end of the Cold War, they discovered that KGB officials had identified Whitmore as their most dangerous opponent by the mid-1950s, recognizing that his analytical methods posed a fundamental threat to traditional Soviet espionage techniques. Internal KGB documents revealed that his success in identifying Soviet agents had forced major changes in Soviet operational doctrine, including the abandonment of several long-term penetration operations and the development of new security procedures designed to counter his innovative surveillance techniques. The extent of his impact on Soviet intelligence activities was far greater than Western officials had realized at the time, as his operations had not only disrupted specific KGB activities, but also forced broader changes in how Soviet intelligence services approached their missions throughout Western Europe. Perhaps most significantly, Soviet files indicated that fear of Whitmore's methods had contributed to a defensive mindset within KGB operations that reduced their overall effectiveness and limited their willingness to undertake certain high-risk operations that might have achieved significant intelligence benefits. This revelation added new dimensions to assessments of his career, suggesting that his influence extended far beyond the specific operations in which he had directly participated to shape the broader strategic environment within which Cold War espionage activities occurred. The recognition that his methods had forced adaptive changes in enemy behavior validated his fundamental insight that effective counterintelligence required not only detecting and neutralizing specific threats, but also influencing enemy decision-making processes in ways that reduced their overall operational effectiveness. This understanding would prove particularly valuable as intelligence services adapted to new challenges in the post-Cold War era, when traditional state-based espionage threats were supplemented by new forms of intelligence warfare involving non-state actors and asymmetric operational methods. Today, James Whitmore's legacy can be seen in counterintelligence methods used by intelligence services throughout the democratic world, from the analytical techniques employed to identify foreign agents to the operational doctrines that guide decisions about when to pursue conventional investigative methods and when circumstances require more flexible approaches. His career demonstrated that effectiveness in intelligence work often depends on the ability to recognize when established procedures are inadequate and the courage to develop new approaches despite institutional resistance and personal risk. The tension between innovation and accountability that defined his professional life continues to influence debates about intelligence policy and operational methods, reminding current practitioners that the most significant threats often require responses that go beyond conventional wisdom and established protocol. His story illustrates a fundamental truth about leadership under pressure, that the individuals who make the greatest difference are often those who understand when rules must be broken to achieve the larger purposes that those rules were designed to serve. The question his career poses to each generation of intelligence professionals, and indeed to anyone facing critical decisions under pressure, remains as relevant today as it was during the height of the Cold War. When confronting unprecedented challenges that existing procedures cannot address, do you follow orders that may lead to failure, or do you risk everything on your judgment about what needs to be done? Whitmore chose to break the rules, and in doing so, he helped write new rules that protected democratic societies for generations. Share this story and comment below about what courage means to you Because understanding the price of freedom requires remembering the individuals who were willing to risk everything to preserve it for the rest of us.